All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the August 26th edition of Noisy Reality. We're very happy today to have Charles Kamps here to talk about the British Army and the Revolution. Charles was a professor at the U.S. Air Force Staff College at Maxwell for 25 years, right, Chuck?
24, yeah, right.
24. And he is a historian and has designed some very, very classic military simulations. And we're here to explore this issue, which we will explore again with others. But I was going to actually start this off with that famous, I think it's Howard Pyle who did that shot of the British storming up on Bunker Hill. But I turn it over to you, Chuck.
Okay. All right. Okay, we're going to adapting to insurgency, the British Army in the Revolution. This subject may seem a bit arcane in our own period of asymmetric warfare, but there are real misconceptions about what happened. If you're old enough to remember your primary school rendition of how the revolution went, sadly, there are quite educated people who actually believe it is close to the truth. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Okay, where are we going? The agenda is, what were the myths? What was the reality? And why did Britain lose? The emphasis today is not on the political grand strategy of the revolution or a blow-by-blow narrative of the campaigns, but rather I'd like to dispel a number of myths about the effectiveness of the British Army as an institution and its tactics, techniques, and procedures. Okay, we'll start out with a little Sam Kinison here. Okay, Professor Tergeson says, General Washington, oops, wait a minute. Let's get back to here. All right. General Washington, you won the toss. You get to wear dark colors, hide behind trees, and snipe at the British. Okay, and General Howe, you lost the toss. You get to wear red coats and march in straight lines out in the open. Okay, Sam had it pretty simplistic there, but let's go peel back the onion. The British Army had a pretty good reputation in Europe, and I'll give a good example of these, of their reputation. They starting out in the early 18th century, they became a real force in military activity. Starting with the Duke of Marlborough's string of victories in the early 18th century at Blenheim, 1704, Ramillies, 1706, Oudenarde, 1708, and Malplaquet, 1709. The British Army proved itself a tough, resourceful, and largely victorious opponent against peer enemies both in Europe and later in America. Success was built on good training and good leadership, and was evident in the 7 Years' War. For example, in this conflict, at Minden in Germany in 1759, 6 British infantry battalions actually charged the main body of French mounted cavalry and drove them off. This is a very unique achievement for infantry. Unfortunately, the reputation most people recall from the American part of the conflict, the French and Indian War, was a lot less complimentary. Let's go on a short tangent and examine this. Well, if Americans recall anything, it's the misfortune of General Edward Braddock in the early part of the conflict. As in this picture, his defeat has been cast as the ambush of a general unaware of conditions in America. Nothing could have been further from the truth. In the event, his 2 regular regiments, both from the undermanned Irish establishment, were filled out with green American recruits. Little training time was available before the expedition, and officers tended to fall back on what they knew, in spite of Braddock's efforts to instruct them in local conditions. Nevertheless, the engagement was a bit different than popularly imagined. As can be seen on this diagram, Braddock's deployments were sound and precluded any chance of the British being surprised. In fact, it was the French who were surprised. Their commander, Captain Beaujeu, was killed in the first few shots, and the bulk of his force, Indians and Canadian militia, started to bolt. Captain Dumas, the French second in command, ordered his 2 companies of French colonial marines to slug it out with the British advance guard, while by sheer force of personality, he rallied the Indians and Canadians and instructed them to remain behind cover and engage the British column along its length. After 3 hours of combat, the Brits retreated, losing many officers, including Braddock himself. However, we tend to forget some important items. Special British units employed during the F&I War, such as Rogers Rangers, Gage's Light Infantry, and the 60th Royal Americans, were as good at irregular fighting as were the enemy. Shown here, Scottish Highlanders are defeating Pontiac's Indians at Bushy Run in 1763. And, in the final analysis, the war was not won by irregular engagements, but by major battles like Quebec, sieges such as Fort Ticonderoga, and a blockade by Britain's Royal Navy. Britain's victory over the French was decisive in America. Now let's look at the popular myths that have been carried away from the Revolution proper. Okay, myth. British soldiers were little more than low morale mercenaries, likened to the German mercenaries who were dragooned into service by their princes to fight in America. Well, let's take a look at the nature of the army and its soldiers. It was a volunteer service, except for 2 short periods of draft for county militias back in England. There were some criminals in the army, but it was not an army of criminals. The largest group of recruits consisted of unemployed farm workers. The second largest recruit group consisted of laid-off textile workers, about 20%. The typical soldier was a professional, about 30 years of age, with 10 years of service, and he physically compared favorably with the population. The regiment was the centerpiece and de facto family of the soldier, providing cohesion in battle. His wages were low, but so were his needs. Because of the overwhelming number of soldiers who were unmarried, 6 wives were allowed on the strength of each company deploying overseas to serve as nurses, cooks, and laundresses. They received half of a soldier's pay and rations for their work. By our standards, the health conditions were poor, but were slightly higher than those of the civilian population of England. Training was under the supervision of long service NCOs who were skilled and experienced, and by comparison made the French Foreign Legion sergeant in beau geste look like a sissy. The typical training day was 6 hours, 2 hours of physical conditioning and running, not typical in your 18th century armies. 2 hours of manual and platoon exercise, that is, weapons and close order drill, and 2 hours of company and battalion maneuvers. Alternatively, a battalion might undertake a 15-mile route march or a forced march of 25 to 30 miles in a day. When deployed in America, marksmanship practice and prizes were instituted throughout the Army. Okay, myth. British tactical organization was largely ineffective. In practice, the size of the regiment may vary from 1,000 men in 2 battalions to 200, 250 after wastage on campaign. But the pre-war infantry regiment had a normal establishment of 477 men, organized as 1 battalion of 8 line companies, 1 grenadier company for shock action, and 1 light infantry company for skirmishing. Often in the field, grenadier and light companies from a number of regiments would be consolidated to form composite battalions to leverage their special skills. The battalion maneuvered at slow or quick pace, which was either 75 or 120 steps per minute, and could fight in all terrain. Command and control was effective, and the battalion could maneuver under the voice of one man, with drum signals to relay orders. Firepower. Troops carried the Brown Bess musket, the standard for world military small arms, for over a century. This 14-pound smoothbore musket mounted a bayonet with a 17-inch blade and fired a 75 caliber, that is 3/4 of an inch, lead ball weighing 1 ounce. The rate of fire was 3 rounds per minute standard, up to 5 rounds per minute in emergencies. The battalion could unleash devastating volleys of musketry at normal combat ranges of 40 to 80 yards. Royal artillery guns. Each regiment normally had its own attached artillery, 2 battalion guns, either 3-pounders or 6-pounders, to provide organic fire support at close range, a sort of combined arms team. These were operated by Royal Artillery gunners, assisted by infantrymen. The guns could be broken down for transport and were mobile enough to be manhandled over any terrain, even when assembled. As conditions in North America were not suited to large cavalry actions, the 2 British light dragoon regiments which deployed were mainly engaged in reconnaissance, escort duties, screening, carrying dispatches, and support of Tory mounted units. Because of the lack of locally available horses in America, most remounts had to endure a long sea voyage from Britain. Myth. British uniforms were unsuitable for America. All right. The uniforms you are used to seeing on the silver screen or in portraits are on the left, where a lieutenant of the reenactment 33rd Regiment inspects a sentry. This appearance was certainly in evidence in garrison and on the parade ground, and British soldiers were renowned for their smart turnout. In the field, however, this look gave way to the bleached-out short jackets, canvas trousers, and slouched hats worn in the picture on the right by reenactors of the 40th Regiment on campaign in America. Myth. British officers were just overdressed buffoons. Similar to the enlisted men, on parade, the well-turned-out officer was a sight to behold, such as the gentleman on the left, typical of the Boston garrison of 1775. But after the Battle of Bunker Hill, most officers went to the field dressed as the Guards officer on the right, with a very plain coat, no gorget or epaulets, and trim removed. In addition, the officer's pike was laid aside, and most of them blended in by carrying a fusil or musket like the men. 25% of regimental officers and over 50% of the generals came from either the aristocracy or the major landed gentry. They had money and influence. The largest group came from the lesser gentry. Another sizable number came from the, quote, army families, end quote, or from foreign gentlemen in Britain, usually Huguenot French refugees. The smallest group consisted of senior NCOs who were commissioned from the ranks and provided very valuable cadre for forming new units. Although 2/3 of all officer commissions were purchased, that did not mean that the officer corps was amateur. They may not have studied war in depth, but they were, for the most part, very familiar with the handbooks produced by Generals Kane and Bland and Captains Symes and Cuthbertson. Junior officers were expected to be good men to the hounds and lead by example. Senior officers demonstrated tactical competence time and again in an overwhelming number of major battles, including the illustration here from Brandywine. All right. Myth, the British Army was tactically inflexible. The British Army proved extremely adaptable to the war in America. One example is the practice of using open files. You are all familiar with the shoulder-to-shoulder British formations, as shown here. Well, they really didn't fight that way. From early 1776 on, the orderly books of Howe, Burgoyne, and Clinton specified files be spaced with 18 inches separating each man from the next. This makes sense in a country where movement around obstacles is frequent and where the enemy has a reputation, deserved or not, for marksmanship. In similar fashion, the standard 3 ranks deep formation was reduced to 2 ranks, which proved superior and was subsequently used in the Napoleonic Wars. All right, myth. The British always fought in rigid linear formations. Regular army units, such as the 1st Foot Guards in the upper left, conducted patrol operations as a matter of course. The light infantry in the lower right is demonstrating skirmishing intervals. General Howe's light infantry instructions, devised before the war in 1774, prescribed 2 feet between men at normal order, 4 feet between men at open order, and 10 feet between men at extended order. Myth. The Americans were better at surprise. Well, we're all very familiar with Washington's excellent surprise attacks at Trenton and Princeton. But let's see how the British did it. Probably the most foremost practitioner of surprise night attacks was Major General Charles No Flint Gray, who earned his nickname by ordering his men to remove the flints from their muskets so that no inadvertent fire could tip off the enemy. Gray's men fell on the camp of Mad Anthony Wayne's Pennsylvania Division at Paoli on the night of 21 September 1777 and decimated them. Another example of the prowess of British tactical commanders in a night attack was the attack on Baylor's 3rd Continental Light Dragoons by Lieutenant Colonel John Maitland's 2nd Light Infantry Battalion on the evening of 28 September 1778 at Old Tappan, New Jersey. Only 37 American troopers escaped. Myth. British were outmatched by American riflemen. Well, while Americans certainly had legendary riflemen and units such as Daniel Morgan's Virginians, Washington replaced most rifles that were in the hands of the Continental Army soldiers with regular smoothbore muskets. It seems that the riflemen were prima donnas who didn't care for fatigue duty, and they were prone to being run off the battlefield by bayonet-wielding British light infantry. Probably the best-known shot in the Continental Army was made by Tim Murphy, who felled Brigadier General Simon Fraser during the Saratoga campaign, shown in this illustration. However, the British had their own riflemen, the best known being Major Patrick Ferguson, who invented a breech-loading rifle. I say again, a breech-loading rifle. I'll describe it later if you like. And I commanded a picked unit of 100 men at Brandywine. Ironically, he had a sure shot at General Washington before the battle and decided to pass it up. Ferguson was subsequently wounded and his special unit was disbanded. Ferguson was very chivalrous, and he saw Washington out on reconnaissance and said, well, this guy's just trying to look at the battlefield. He's not really commanding anything right now. Why should I shoot at him? So he missed a chance to do really bad stuff. Okay, but as the war progressed, each British infantry regiment acquired non-standard Prussian rifles at a scale of about 5 per company, and normally concentrated them to form a specialist rifle company in each battalion. In addition, Hessian auxiliaries included a total of 1,000 rifle-armed Jaegers. Myth: the British could not cope with guerrillas. Okay, rather than show Marion, Pickens, and Sumter, I just put their composite together and put Mel Gibson from the movie The Patriot on the left to represent American guerrillas. On the other side is, of course, Bannister Tarleton, an over-promoted cavalry lieutenant who led his Tory bully boys around burning plantations and rousting women and children. He did accomplish some legitimate guerrilla activity, but was decisively defeated by the old wagoner Daniel Morgan at the Battle of Cowpens. He was not, however, like the chap that they show in The Patriot. British officers did not go around setting fire to churches that were inhabited by Americans. They just didn't do that. Okay, now, a little by-the-way story on Tarleton. In his subsequent career, Tarleton wrote to the editor of the London Times saying how interesting it would be to talk with Napoleon. The editor wrote back in the column that, quote, one can only imagine the conqueror of Vienna discussing tactics with the loser of Cowpens, end quote. All right. Other and better guerrilla leaders on the British side are represented by John Graves Simcoe and his Queen's Rangers, a mixed infantry cavalry force of skirmishers and riflemen. They wore green uniforms and specialized in unconventional warfare. Okay, now the most enduring myth that came out of the war was not concerning the British per se, but the Americans. It was the myth of the militia. Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill led to enduring myths about how the British regulars could be bested by simple militia, a legend that stunted the growth of any American standing army for over a century. The truth, of course, was not so cut and dried. By the second half of the war, the British were using loose order tactics to defeat the Americans, while the American militia looked like uninspired pre-war Brits. Okay, so we come to, why was the war lost by Britain? All the foregoing naturally begs the question, if the British Army successfully adapted the conditions of warfare in America, and was, by and large, very competent, then why did Britain lose the war? Let's look at some of the reasons. Number one, dumb colonial policy. King George really was an idiot, not his ministers. Time and again, the king wanted to punish his recalcitrant subjects rather than reconcile through political compromise. Britain's benign neglect could have been corrected, and the colonists would have been happy to stay in the fold. After all, it had started as a revolution for the rights of Englishmen. Unfortunately, when the Crown occupied an area, it did not even trust the local Tories, and thus popular support for the king subsided. Inadequate war planning. Lord North, the Prime Minister, favored a conciliatory approach toward the colonies. and his attempts to resign were denied by the king until 1782. Parliament itself was divided, with a vociferous anti-war faction under the Marquis of Rockingham siding with the Americans. Worse still, it was the Secretary of State for the American colonies who had charged the running of the war from London. This was Lord George Germain, a former Army general who, for his conduct in the 7 Years' War, was cashiered by a court-martial with the added reproof that he was, quote, unfit to serve His Majesty in any military capacity whatsoever, end quote. Just the kind of person you need to head the higher direction of your war effort.
Good.
Okay, overextended lines of communication. Everything, including ammunition, food, and horses, had to come 3,000 miles from Britain, a journey which could take a couple of months and was subjected to the storms of the North Atlantic and the depredations of American privateer vessels. Even worse, higher direction from London was subject to the same distances and methods of travel, which led to disasters of coordination, such as Saratoga. American Army competence. With the help of von Steuben and other European officers, training got serious, and the Americans became much better opponents. Time and experience turned the Continental Army into a very good professional force. Washington knew that the colonies would lack credibility until the Continental Army could duke it out toe-to-toe with the British, and that became his training goal. The first time he was able to fight the British to a draw was Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, on 28 June 1778. The battle was fought in 100-degree heat, and so are the reenactments. I can say personally. All right, Saratoga and foreign intervention. In October of 1777, the badly outnumbered General Burgoyne had to surrender his command in upstate New York, giving the colonials a signal victory. Combined with active diplomatic lobbying, this was instrumental in securing assurances of French active participation in the war. The ultimate result was World War Zero. Britain eventually found itself in a world war against the powers and colonies of France, Spain, and the Netherlands. In addition, it faced the hostility of the League of Armed Neutrality, consisting of Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Denmark, and Portugal. Quite an array. Accordingly, the British had to decide whether to keep the main effort in the 13 colonies, which were in rebellion, or withdraw substantial forces to protect Canada, the West Indies, Gibraltar, Minorca, India, and other overseas possessions. They decided to protect the rest of the empire and removed half the force from America. To put the icing on the cake, the lackluster Admiral Thomas Graves, commanding the Royal Navy's force supporting General Cornwallis in the Yorktown campaign, was repulsed by Admiral de Grasse's French fleet. And that meant that another outnumbered British army had to surrender, ending major land combat between the colonists and England. The irony of it all is that had Admiral Sir George Rodney or his second in command, Admiral Sir Samuel Hood, been in charge, the French would have been defeated, as they were 6 months later at the Battle of the Saints in April of 1782, with 𝗔𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃 being captured in the bargain. However, by then the war had shifted to other theaters, and the American colonies were effectively independent, formally so by 1783. Perhaps the greatest single factor in the eventual American victory was one man, George Washington. Washington, who time and again doubted his own ability to command, was often the only man who kept the revolution alive. His force of will kept an army in the field when nearly everyone else was ready to throw in the towel and beg forgiveness from the crown. If there is one figure in America who deserves the greatest respect for the achievement of independence, it is George Washington, who, ironically, as a young man, wanted to be an officer in the British Army. Thank you. I stand ready to answer your questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Superb presentation, the best one I've ever heard. By far, the best one I have ever heard.
All right.
Wonderful.
Thank
Just
you.
wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Go on, Julian.
I second that.
Go on, Julian.
Yeah, Chuck, thank you so much. I mean, it's a really a fantastic presentation because it gets into the nitty gritty that's not often talked about. I have a sort of a prior question, which I don't have any knowledge of. I compare the British incompetence in this conflict to their lack of support of Marlborough. I mean, Marlborough was sent to the continent, I think about 100 years earlier, to deal with Louis XIV threatening. He wanted to go all the way to the Holy Land, but he was going to do it through obviously the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And so the British got together with the Dutch and many others. And once Marlborough started to win, London reverted to politics, and you had parliamentarians and their propagandists like Jonathan Swift, who spent, basically they had put local domestic politics above, well, the needs of the nation. And this went on for, I think it went on for over half a decade, and Marlborough couldn't even return to England. I'm wondering, what explains, George III's behavior and the fact that he had weak ministers giving him poor advice? Certainly the monarch should have learned from the previous civil war and the Glorious Revolution that monarchs, if they're wildly incompetent, they get replaced. And that, when ministers in England don't support sound policy and get involved in local politics, it tends to result in defeat. Can you speculate? What was going on in London that made a British rule so ineffective?
Well, this is purely speculation on my part, and I'm not exactly sure when his mental issues became a factor. I know they did at some point, but I'm not sure whether it was in this period or not. But generally, he was still in the driver's seat. He thought he was still of the idea that, hey, a monarch is a monarch. None of this constitutional monarch type of business like you later get with Britain. He was, I'm in charge. And these people, like I said, he wanted to punish him. He did not want to treat with them. He says, they're my people, and I'm going to do with them what I want because they're mine. They belong to me. All this stuff belongs to me. And, it was just, he was like forgetting that it was 175 years worth of Anglo-Dutch people had operated there without being independent, but they had their own way of doing things, and he just didn't buy it. for him, it was, it was my way or the highway. And he was certainly ready to send the largest expedition that the British had ever mounted over to New York to start off the ball. And, it was finally, he was about to get picked by everybody else, including the French. And it was the end of it. But I'm not sure. It was the I don't think the government had at that time the wherewithal to be able to, just tell the king, hey, you're out of it, boy. We can't do this. They were certainly wanted to give up on the idea that it was a full monarchy, but and didn't do it. They were still loyal to a degree, and of course, in the end, that didn't work. But I can't really say anything. I'm not a specialist in British parliamentary politics of that particular period.
May I ask one follow-up? Again, another speculative question, a counterfactual. If there had been no George III and there'd been also no George Washington, how long do you think a different later American Revolution would eventually have occurred? Or would America become like a giant Canada?
That's right.
You got me.
Thank you very much.
That is really speculative. I have no idea. Of course, some people say that the War of 1812 was the Second American Revolution. They think that the Brits were trying to reestablish control, which, believe it or not. But
Yeah, well, we're going to get into that, Julian. Those are very interesting questions you raised, because obviously George III is taken over by his grandfather when he's a kid, and he's given Lord Bute as his tutor. And so Lord Bute is very important in influencing his attitudes about the royalty, about the monarchy. And then when his grandfather dies in 1760, and he becomes the king, it's very interesting to see how his attitudes are shaped by Lord Bute. Lord Bute is very important in his formation, but we're going to get into all that as time goes on. Michael, go on, Michael. Just have to unmute, Michael.
Yeah, okay, it took me a second. Yeah, yeah, great talk. And a couple of questions. One, it seems as if what you're basically saying, the reasons that the British lost were because the American Revolution became sort of, if I can use this word, a backwater. I mean, in other words, it became of a lower priority in the other events going around the globe. Also, it would seem that in Britain itself, the war against the American colonists was not an especially popular war, perhaps because of the fact that they were basically formerly British subjects. I mean, George Washington had become a British officer, actually. But so the question is, I mean, is that one question is, would that be the essential reason why the British basically lost, not, in addition to withdrawing the troops and putting more of an emphasis, perhaps rightfully so, on Canada and the West Indies? But could that be the essential reason, a combination of lowering in priority and also the unpopular nature of the war in Britain, or the less popular nature of the war in Britain? And also one more specific question, because this is the myth I always grew up with was that the Americans rarely won a battle, and it wasn't for the French, they probably wouldn't have won. But if Burgoyne had been able to, if he had, in other words, gotten support from to the south of him, and had won the Battle of Saratoga, do you think that would have been the decisive battle that ended the revolution? That's another popular myth. Okay. I'll let you go.
A lot of ifs in there. Your first two propositions, I think you're absolutely right on. The fact that the rest of the empire was under threat and they were not doing particularly well in America, they'd have to be fighting against their own type of people there rather than trying to fight against foreigners and holding on to all the other stuff. So hey, you just choose what's most important to you, and they could kind of tell that the American colonies were not going to be the winner in the end. I mean, the winning ticket in the end for them. So that was the one thing. I don't know about the Saratoga campaign. That would have taken a lot because number one, you'd have had to have much better communications between London and America, and then have somebody who was a Clinton go north and do something like that. They were still they had they were outnumbered still. And if you ever want to see something that's really good, Bernard Shaw wrote a great play that was turned into a movie.
The Devil's Disciple. Yeah.
And that's really kind of funny. It just follows Burgoyne going down there, and it's a lot of fun. It's a funny movie, but it kind of gives you an idea of the problems that they were facing there. I don't know. That's a real, you'd have to war game that thing out, and there are a lot of ifs in that. I would not be ready to stake my professional reputation on that being a British victory if they did that. You see, the problem was that in New York and the New York garrison, they were still of the idea that Washington was going to take New York back. And he, all the way to the end of the thing at Yorktown, was showing a threat to New York. And they held it right to the bitter end. And had they launched a large expedition to try and help Burgoyne out, they were afraid that they'd lose their major base of operations. So there were good military reasons why that didn't turn out the way it would have.
How do you think they war game things in those days? If they did,
I don't think they did. I mean, normally what they did in those days, they didn't have the same staff system as we have. They'd have what is called a council of war, where the major commanders would get together and they'd discuss what the issues were, and then they'd see if they could all agree on something. And that's the way they did it. But usually the best tactics are those of the senior commander. So that's always the way it turns out.
yeah.
Actually, I should also point out, just a point of information, that when you're reading The Devil's Disciple, which is one of my more favorite plays, there's actually an addendum to the play with a long portrait, basically, of General Burgoyne's actions and at the time of at the Battle of Saratoga and afterwards, and it was quite historically useful, especially for that time, that period in history when the play came out. Anyway, glad you brought it up.
Sure.
And the other one question, I mean, as far as George III, wasn't there also just a problem with this thing called, in other words, American expansionism, the desire of the colonies to expand westward, as opposed to what George wanted, which also includes deals he made with First Nations peoples. So wasn't that already creating a problem that George III wanted to put a stop to?
No, undoubtedly they kept that up for a long time, but I don't think it had much of an effect on what their tactics were. I mean, they had token amounts of forces in the West, and you read about those, but you're talking about small numbers of folks that are out there running things, and they wouldn't have really had anything to do with it unless there was a major American defeat on the East Coast. I don't think it would have mattered much. Geez, wouldn't have taken long for the French to come back in. In fact, I live in a place that was occupied by the French. Down here, a couple of miles away, is Fort Toulouse at the confluence of the Coosa, Tallapoosa, and Alabama rivers and the East-West Indian trade trails. And that was one of the big places in New France, as it were, Louisiana Territory. Well, they could have come back in. There was some reason why the Brits allowed the folks in Canada to keep the French language instead of forcing them all to speak English.
Well, they speak English out here in the West.
Oh,
well,
yeah,
the Canadians do out here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm talking
But
about
the
Quebec.
debate is still going on in the East. So,
Oh yeah.
Well, we're going to get into that. I mean, because obviously when we talk about 1763, what leads to the Royal Proclamation in October, which is where they say settlers can't go west of the Alleghenies, is the revolt of Pontiac. And so I'm digging out a person who's a specialist on that. Frank, go on, Frank.
Yeah, I think actually the most important treaty that was signed was the compact between Spain and France. It was Charles III in 1761, I think, who signed that compact that made it possible for the Bourbon fleets to totally dominate the seas, which they did. I mean, in 1779, there was a threat of invasion of Britain, and they could put 60 ships, which the Brits couldn't match at all. So once that compact happened, then dominance, hegemonic power would actually go to the Bourbon kings, which it did. And so I would argue that, Benjamin Franklin was the smart one, and Vergennes used him. And I think it was, a proxy war that, the French were extremely good as admirals. And, if you read Mahan, he would disagree with you, I think, that, de Grasse was not that good. He was actually excellent in the open sea. The Battle of the Saints is a different kind of battle. But in the open sea, French gunnery was far excelled the Brits, who were, trying to close, but they just shot away their masts and what have you. And so you couldn't succeed in breaking the blockade to Yorktown. And then you've got the generals, Rochambeau, and you've got Galvez, who took Pensacola. I mean, that took Florida away from the Brits. And obviously, once, as you pointed out, the allies of the United States came together, there was no way the Brits could field anything more than a brigade at any of these battles. Instead of, like at Brooklyn Heights, they had 15,000, but you never saw that again. So I would say it was the innovativeness and far-sightedness of Charles III of Spain and Louis XVI that made it possible for the United States to keep its colonies, to become independent. But that's my opinion.
Oh yeah, positively. If there had not been foreign intervention, the Americans would have been in real trouble. Right, Galvez and his folks, and of course, the French did very well, but it cost them too much money, and they ended up losing their heads over it.
Right. Right. Again, we're going to cover all these things in detail in months to come. Alex, go on, Alex.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about, you would think that, the Native Americans being so antagonistic to the 13 colonies that the British would have been able more to use them. But even in some cases where they do, like, in the Saratoga campaign, then you have the incident with Jane McCrae that the colonists really use greatly, with propaganda to mobilize more militia. And then, as a result, Burgoyne gets, disgusted with the Indians, sends most of them away, but then he has very poor Indian scouting for the, and is much harder for him to scout out, the American positions. So when he shows up at Freeman's Farm, he's kind of partly blind. So yeah, I just wonder what you think in general of British use of First Nations military on their side, the Revolutionary War.
Very well. Any other comments, questions, qualms, quorums?
Anybody else have a comment or question?
Sorry, I thought Alex just asked a question.
Oh, really? Well, yeah, about the whole question of the impact of native troops, if you will, of tribes in accelerants to both the Americans and the British, but certainly he was focusing on the British.
Yeah, essentially my presentation was aimed at the British Army per se.
Charming.
And myths about the British Army.
All right. Well, we'll get to that. 𝐀𝐝𝐚𝐩𝐿𝐴 is unfortunately sick. And so when he recovers, we're going to have him deal with this issue in depth. 𝐀𝐝𝐚𝐩𝐿𝐴 is the author of a book on George Washington and Native Americans, also did a book about the Battle of Fallen Timbers, etc., and all those fighting that occurred in the early 1790s, and also did a book on the impact of the Proclamation of 1763. So we'll get to him. Does anybody else have any comments? Jay or Mark? Tom, anybody else?
I just thought it was superb presentation. Yeah.
All right.
I did too. I really enjoyed it. It was very well researched and presented.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your comments.
It was excellent.
Great.
Yes.
It was indeed. Julian, you have a final comment.
Yes, I put up a link on the side to Canada's 1837 rebellion, and it's the Mackenzie Rebellion in Upper Canada, which is Ontario, but there was also a revolt in Lower Canada that included, of course, the French Canadians, but also included English who participated with the French Canadian Revolt. And it's meant to highlight that that I think the American Revolution was inevitable, and that the British, probably were outsmarted by an international revenge alliance for the 7 Years' War during the American Revolution proper. But if the revolution had come 50 years later, the Americans would have been even more American. And as Charles pointed out, you have 175 years of Anglo-Dutch culture that had veered on its own with limited self-government. And the fact that even Canada revolted in 1837, if you look at the link, it almost included the US. The British were sparring with the Americans to keep them from intervening. It shows that no amount of British tactical success could, in the end, stop a tide of greater and greater ease of mobilization by what was essentially already a different culture.
Well, it's a great topic, and we're going to do a lot on this. I should add that tomorrow, on Thursday, Ivan Torres is going to talk about Spain's contribution in the American Revolution. And then in about a week and a half, a lecturer from Columbia University, Bob Neer, is going to talk about the American Revolution. And then we're going to have somebody from the University of Chicago talking about the British East India Company and its role in the origins of the American Revolution. Right now, I'm concentrating on the origins, but also it's great to have this kind of discussion about the practical military aspects of it. I'm looking for people who can talk about the militia, And unfortunately, I don't know where Robin Wright is. I don't even know where he is because Robin, of course, did that great book for OCMH on the Continental Army. And he'd be terrific to have as a speaker if I can figure out where he is these days, if he's still alive. But anyway, I want to thank you so much, Charles. It was really excellent. And thank you so much for spending time to put such a great talk together. Thank you so much.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
All right. You guys have a great evening.
Right
Okay.
on.